My son texted, "Don't contact us again," so I quietly sold the house he planned to inherit. The text message arrived at 11:47 p.m. on a Thursday, jolting me awake from the light sleep that had become my constant companion since my wife Margaret died 8 months earlier. I fumbled for my reading glasses on the nightstand, squinting at the phone screen that blazed like a beacon in my dark bedroom. "Dad, we've had enough. Your constant criticism and interference in our lives needs to stop. Don't contact us again. We need space to live our lives without your judgment and negativity." I read the message 3 times before its full meaning sank in. The sender was my son David, 32 years old, married to Rebecca for 5 years, and the father of my 2 grandchildren, Emma, 7, and little Jake, 4. David, who had once called me his hero, who used to spend entire weekends helping me restore the 1962 Chevy pickup that still sat in my garage, who had stood beside me at his mother's funeral with his arm around my shoulders while I struggled to hold myself together. My hands were shaking as I scrolled up through our recent text conversations, trying to understand what could have prompted such a harsh ultimatum. Our last exchange had been 3 days earlier, when I'd asked if I could take the kids to the county fair on Saturday. David had responded with a curt, "We're busy," and I'd replied that maybe the following weekend would work better. Nothing in that conversation seemed to warrant this level of hostility, but as I scrolled further back, a pattern began to emerge that I hadn't recognized in the moment. Comments I'd made about Rebecca's decision to quit her teaching job to become a life coach. Questions I'd asked about David's frequent job changes over the past 2 years. Suggestions I'd offered about financial planning when I'd noticed they'd upgraded to a more expensive house, newer cars, and seemed to be living well beyond what I estimated their income could support. Had I been critical? Maybe. Had I been interfering? Probably. But I'd thought I was being a concerned father, offering guidance based on 64 years of life experience and the wisdom that comes from making your own share of mistakes. I got out of bed and walked to the kitchen, flipping on the light and staring at my phone as if the words might change if I looked at them long enough. "Don't contact us again." The finality of it felt like a door slamming shut, cutting me off from the only family I had left in the world. Margaret would have known what to do. She'd always been the diplomatic one in our family, the one who could smooth over conflicts and find middle ground. When David and I butted heads during his teenage years, she'd been the bridge between us when David went through his rebellious phase in college, when he dropped out of his engineering program to pursue music, when he'd moved in with Rebecca, despite our concerns about their age difference and his financial instability. "Give him time," Margaret used to say whenever David and I had our disagreements. "He'll come around. He's more like you than either of you want to admit, and that's exactly why you clash so much." But Margaret wasn't here anymore, and without her mediating presence, it seemed like David and I had lost the ability to communicate without triggering each other's worst impulses. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table where Margaret and I had eaten breakfast together for 28 years, where David had done his homework as a child, where we'd celebrated birthdays and holidays, and all the ordinary moments that make up a family's life. The silence in the house was deafening, made worse by the knowledge that it might be permanent now. Over the next few days, I tried to respect David's request for space, while still hoping he might reconsider. I didn't call or text, but I couldn't stop myself from checking his social media accounts, at least until I discovered he'd blocked me on Facebook and Instagram sometime in the past week. Rebecca had blocked me too, which suggested this decision had been discussed and mutually agreed upon rather than being an impulsive reaction to some perceived slight. The isolation was crushing in a way I hadn't anticipated. Since Margaret's death, my weekly dinners with David's family had been the bright spots in my grief-darkened world. Emma's excited chatter about school and friends, Jake's endless questions about everything from why the sky was blue to how cars worked, David and Rebecca's updates about their jobs and plans, it had all helped me feel connected to life beyond my own loss. Now, cut off from my grandchildren and estranged from my only child, I found myself rattling around in the 4-bedroom house that had once felt perfectly sized for our family, but now seemed cavernous and empty. Every room held memories of David's childhood, the growth chart marked on the kitchen doorframe, the basketball hoop still mounted over the garage door, the bedroom that had been his until he left for college and had remained essentially unchanged since then. It was while cleaning out Margaret's desk 2 weeks after David's text message that I found the folder labeled estate planning in her careful handwriting. Inside were copies of our wills, life insurance policies, and property records, along with handwritten notes about her thoughts on how our assets should be distributed after we were gone. Most of it was standard. The house, our savings, Margaret's jewelry, my tools and equipment, all to be left to David as our only heir. But there was also a letter Margaret had written but never sent, dated just 3 months before her cancer diagnosis, addressed to David and Rebecca. "My dear son and daughter-in-law," it began, "your father and I have been discussing our estate planning, and we want you to know that we're leaving you the house and everything in it. We know you've been struggling financially, and we hope this knowledge gives you some peace of mind about your future. The house is paid off and worth at least $400,000 in today's market. We also want you to know that we'd prefer you keep it in the family if possible, maybe as a place for Emma and Jake to grow up. the way you grew up here. This house has been our family's heart for 30 years, and we can't imagine it belonging to strangers. $400,000. I set the letter down and stared at it, processing the implications of what Margaret had written. David and Rebecca knew, or at least had known 3 years ago, that they were inheriting this house. They'd been counting on it, planning around it, making financial decisions based on the security of knowing they had a $400,000 asset waiting for them in the future. Suddenly, David's lifestyle choices over the past few years made more sense. The expensive house they'd bought despite his irregular income, Rebecca's decision to leave her stable teaching job to start her own business, their comfort with carrying credit card debt and car payments that seemed beyond their means. They'd been living as if they already had access to their inheritance, confident that my death would eventually solve any financial problems they couldn't handle on their own. I felt sick to my stomach as the full picture came into focus. My son hadn't just cut me out of his life. He'd done so while still expecting to benefit from my death. He'd told me not to contact him again, but he was undoubtedly still planning to inherit everything I'd worked my entire life to build. The next morning, I called David's number from my landline, thinking maybe he'd only blocked my cell phone. But the call went straight to voicemail, and when I tried to leave a message, I heard the automated response. "This number is not accepting messages from your phone number." He'd blocked me completely. Home phone? Cell phone? Probably my email address too. David had cut me out of his life so thoroughly that there was no way for me to reach him even in an emergency. That afternoon, I drove to David's house for the first time since receiving his text message. I didn't plan to knock on the door or create a confrontation. I just wanted to see if they were home, maybe catch a glimpse of my grandchildren playing in the yard. But when I turned onto their street, I discovered they'd installed a security system with cameras pointed toward the road. There was also a sign in their front yard that read "No solicitors," no visitors without prior arrangement. The message was clear: I wasn't welcome, and they'd taken steps to make sure I couldn't approach their home unannounced. I sat in my car at the end of their street, watching their house and trying to process how completely my relationship with my son had deteriorated. This wasn't just a temporary disagreement or a cooling-off period. David had systematically removed me from his life in every way possible, while apparently maintaining his expectation that I would continue to provide for his family's future through my will. That evening, I found myself back in Margaret's desk, reading through the estate planning documents with new eyes. Everything was set up exactly as she'd described in her unsent letter: the house, our savings, my life insurance policy, all of it designated to go to David upon my death. At current property values, my estate was probably worth close to $500,000, most of it tied up in the house that had been our family home for 3 decades. I thought about the growth chart on the kitchen door frame, marked with David's height at every birthday from age 5 through 16. I thought about the times he'd helped me paint the exterior, complaining about the tedium but secretly proud to be trusted with such an important job. I thought about the Christmas mornings when he'd run down the stairs to find presents under the tree in the living room, and the summer evenings when we'd grilled burgers on the back deck while Margaret tended her garden. This house was full of memories, but David had made it clear that my presence in his life was unwelcome. He wanted the inheritance without the relationship, the financial benefit without the emotional investment, the security of knowing he'd be provided for without having to maintain any connection to the person doing the providing. I opened my laptop and began researching real estate agents in our area. If David wanted to cut me out of his life completely, then perhaps it was time for me to reconsider what kind of legacy I wanted to leave behind. The house that Margaret and I had intended to keep in the family might be more valuable to strangers who would appreciate it than to a son who saw it only as a financial asset while treating its current owner as a burden to be avoided. As I scrolled through listings of recently sold properties in our neighborhood, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Margaret's death, a sense of purpose. David had made his choice about our relationship. Now it was time for me to make mine about his inheritance. After all, you can't expect to benefit from someone's life while refusing to be part of it. And if David truly meant what he'd texted, if he really wanted no contact with me ever again, then perhaps it was time to take him at his word and plan my future accordingly. The silence he'd imposed worked both ways. If I was no longer allowed to be his father in life, then maybe he didn't deserve to benefit from me in death. I picked up my phone and started making a list of real estate agents to call in the morning. The first real estate agent I called was Janet Morrison, whose smiling face appeared on bus benches and grocery store bulletin boards throughout our neighborhood. She had the kind of aggressive cheerfulness that I normally found grating, but which seemed appropriate for someone whose job was to convince people that major life changes were exciting opportunities rather than devastating losses. "Mr. Patterson, how wonderful to hear from you. I was so sorry for your loss. Margaret was such a lovely woman. I still think about the roses she grew along your front fence. Now, what can I do for you today?" "I'm thinking about selling the house," I said, the words feeling strange in my mouth. I wanted to get some information about the current market. "Oh my goodness, yes. Your property is absolutely gorgeous, and with the recent development going in on the east side of town, property values in your neighborhood have increased significantly. Are you thinking of downsizing? Moving closer to family, perhaps?" "Moving closer to family? If only Janet knew how impossible that particular goal had become. Something like that, I said. When would be a good time for you to come take a look? How about this afternoon? I have a cancellation at 2 p.m., and I'd love to see what we're working with. After hanging up, I spent the morning walking through the house with fresh eyes, trying to see it the way a potential buyer might, rather than through the lens of 30 years of accumulated memories. The hardwood floors Margaret and I had refinished ourselves during David's senior year of high school. The kitchen we'd remodeled when David was 8, complete with a breakfast nook where he'd eaten countless bowls of cereal while I read him the sports section. The master bedroom where Margaret had spent her final weeks, surrounded by photos of our family and the garden she could see through the window. Janet arrived precisely at 2 p.m., carrying a leather portfolio and wearing the kind of power suit that suggested she took real estate very seriously indeed. She spent an hour measuring rooms, taking photos, and making notes while providing a steady commentary about the property's selling points. The lot size is exceptional for this neighborhood, she said, standing in the backyard and gesturing toward Margaret's now overgrown garden beds. And the mature landscaping adds tremendous value. The bones of this house are solid. You can tell it's been well maintained over the years. My wife was meticulous about maintenance, I said. We never let anything slide. It shows. Mr. Patterson, based on comparable sales in the area over the past 6 months, I'd estimate your property is worth between $420,000 and $450,000. The market is quite strong right now. We're seeing most well-priced homes sell within 30 to 60 days. $420,000 to $450,000. Margaret's estimate in her unsent letter had been conservative. What would need to be done to get it ready for market? I asked. Honestly, very little. Some fresh paint in a few rooms, maybe some minor landscaping to tidy up the gardens, but nothing major. This house shows beautifully as S. Janet left me with a folder full of information about the selling process, comparable home sales, and a listing agreement that would need to be signed if I decided to move forward. After she drove away, I sat at my kitchen table staring at the papers, trying to imagine strangers living in the rooms where my family had grown up. That evening, I decided to drive past David's house one more time, telling myself I just wanted to see if there were any signs of life, any indication that he might be reconsidering his harsh ultimatum. But as I turned onto his street, I saw something that stopped me cold. There was a for sale by owner sign in David's front yard. I parked across the street and stared at the sign, processing what this meant. David was selling his house. The expensive house he'd bought despite his irregular income. The house that had seemed like an imprudent financial decision when he'd purchased it 2 years ago. The house that made sense only if you knew you had a $400,000 inheritance coming your way eventually. I took out my phone and Googled the address, finding the online listing David had created. The asking price was $585,000, nearly twice what he'd paid for the property 2 years earlier. The listing photos showed rooms I'd never seen, decorated with furniture I didn't recognize, featuring upgrades and renovations that must have cost tens of thousands of dollars. But it was the description that really caught my attention. Motivated sellers relocating out of state for new opportunities. Beautiful family home with recent upgrades throughout. Perfect for growing families looking for space and privacy. Relocating out of state? David was planning to move away entirely, taking my grandchildren to some unknown location where I'd never see them again, even if our relationship eventually healed. He'd cut me out of his life completely, and was now preparing to put physical distance between us as well. I scrolled through the photos again, noticing details I'd missed the first time. The kids' bedrooms had been freshly painted and professionally staged. Rebecca's home office space showcased the life coaching business she'd started after leaving her teaching job. David's music room displayed the expensive equipment he'd been accumulating over the past few years. Everything about the listing suggested a family that was thriving financially, a family that could afford to make major life changes and relocate across the country on a whim. It was hard to reconcile this image with Margaret's letter describing David and Rebecca as struggling financially and needing the peace of mind that came from knowing about their inheritance. Unless, of course, they weren't actually thriving at all. Unless the expensive house, the career changes, the lifestyle upgrades, and now the out-of-state move were all being funded by debt that David expected my death to eventually resolve. The next morning, I called Janet Morrison and told her I was ready to list the house. That's wonderful news, Mr. Patterson. How quickly are you hoping to sell? As quickly as possible, I said. I'd like to get it on the market within the week. Perfect. I'll have the photographer out there tomorrow to take listing photos, and we can have you live by the weekend. In this market, I expect we'll have multiple offers within the first 2 weeks. Over the next few days, I threw myself into preparing the house for sale with an energy I hadn't felt since before Margaret's diagnosis. I hired a crew to paint the rooms Janet had suggested, spent a weekend clearing out decades of accumulated belongings, and even tackled Margaret's garden beds to make the landscaping more presentable for potential buyers. It felt good to have a project, a concrete goal that didn't involve sitting alone in an empty house thinking about everything I'd lost. For the first time in months, I had something to look forward to rather than just something to grieve. The listing went live on a Thursday morning, and Janet called me before noon to report that we'd already received 3 inquiries and had 2 showings scheduled for the weekend. "The online interest is incredible," she said. "Your property is priced perfectly for the current market, and the photos turned out beautifully. I think we're going to have a very successful sale." By Sunday evening, we had 4 serious offers, including one for $15,000 over the asking price from a young couple who had fallen in love with Margaret's rose garden and wanted to close within 30 days. I accepted their offer. As I signed the paperwork that would transfer ownership of my family home to strangers, I felt a mixture of sadness and satisfaction that surprised me with its intensity. Sadness for the end of an era, for the memories that would live only in my mind once the house was sold, but satisfaction, too, for taking control of my own destiny, rather than waiting passively for death to resolve my family's financial problems. Janet handled all the details of the sale with the same aggressive efficiency she'd brought to the initial consultation. Title searches, inspections, mortgage approvals, it all proceeded smoothly and quickly, exactly as she'd promised. 3 weeks after listing the house, I received a call from the buyer's mortgage broker with an update on their loan approval process. "Mr. Patterson, I'm calling with good news. The loan has been approved and we're on track for closing as scheduled. I did want to mention, though, that we've been contacted by someone claiming to be your son who's asking questions about the sale. He seemed to think there might be some mistake, that the property wasn't actually supposed to be sold." My heart started racing. "What kind of questions?" "He wanted to know if you were being taken advantage of by unscrupulous agents, whether you were mentally competent to make financial decisions, that sort of thing. He also asked if there was any way to stop the sale or delay the closing." David had found out about the house sale. Somehow, despite blocking me from all forms of communication, he'd discovered that I was selling his inheritance and was trying to interfere with the transaction. "What did you tell him?" I asked. I told him that all real estate transactions are confidential and that I couldn't discuss details with anyone who wasn't party to the sale. "But Mr. Patterson, if there are family concerns about this transaction, now would be the time to address them before we proceed to closing." "There are no concerns," I said firmly. "This is my house, and I'm selling it of my own free will. If anyone contacts you again claiming to represent my interests, please inform them that they have no authority to speak on my behalf." "Understood, sir. We'll proceed as planned." That evening, I sat in my nearly empty living room. Most of the furniture was being donated to charity or going to the new buyers, and tried to imagine the conversation that must have taken place in David's household when he learned about the sale. Had he driven by and seen the sold sign that Janet had planted in the front yard 3 days earlier? Had someone in the neighborhood mentioned it to him? Or had he been keeping closer tabs on my activities than his no-contact ultimatum suggested? I wondered if David was beginning to understand the consequences of cutting me out of his life so completely. When you tell someone don't contact us again, you lose the right to be informed about their major life decisions. When you block all forms of communication, you can't expect to be consulted about matters that affect your future. David had wanted silence. Now he was getting it, along with all the unpleasant surprises that silence can bring. My phone rang at 9:30 that night, displaying a number I didn't recognize. I let it go to voicemail, but when I checked the message, I heard Rebecca's voice for the first time in over a month. "Dad Patterson, this is Rebecca. We heard that you're selling the house, and we're really concerned about this decision. We think you might be acting hastily because of your grief over Mom's death. Please call us back so we can talk about this as a family. We love you, and we want to make sure you're making decisions that are in your best interest. Dad Patterson." She'd never called me that before. It had always been Richard or occasionally Mr. Patterson during the early days of her relationship with David. "And we love you," after weeks of complete silence. After blocking my phone calls and installing security cameras to keep me away from their house, the sudden concern for my well-being was touching, except it had arrived at exactly the same time they'd learned about the house sale, when they'd thought I was just a lonely old man grieving his wife. My mental state hadn't warranted any attention. But now that I was liquidating their inheritance, suddenly, I was a beloved family member whose decisions required their input and approval. I deleted the voicemail without returning the call. 2 days later, closing day arrived with the same gray October weather that had marked so many significant days in my life. I signed the papers transferring ownership of 412 Maple Street to James and Sarah Chen, a young couple with 2 small children who reminded me of David and Rebecca from 15 years ago, back when the future had seemed full of possibilities rather than disappointments. As I handed over the keys to the house where I'd raised my son, where I'd loved my wife, where I'd planned to live out the rest of my days surrounded by family and memories, I felt something I hadn't expected. Relief. For the first time in months, I was free from the weight of other people's expectations. Free from the burden of maintaining a legacy for someone who didn't want to be part of my life. Free from the complicated mathematics of love and money and family obligation that had been consuming me since Margaret's death. I drove away from the closing with a check for $438,000 in my jacket pocket and no idea where I was going to live next. But for the first time since receiving David's text message, I felt like I was in control of my own story. The house was gone. The inheritance was gone. And soon, David would learn exactly what it cost to cut your father out of your life while expecting him to fund your future. I moved into a furnished rental apartment across town 3 days after closing on the house. It was a 2-bedroom unit in a complex designed for people in transition, recent divorcees, job relocators, and apparently fathers who had been disowned by their children. The apartment was generic but comfortable, with none of the memories or expectations that had weighed down every room of the family home. For the first time in months, I slept through the night. The $438,000 from the house sale sat in a money market account while I figured out what to do with the rest of my life. At 64, I was too young for retirement but too old for starting over. Too financially secure to worry about survival but too emotionally wounded to care much about thriving. I was in limbo, and surprisingly, limbo felt like exactly where I needed to be. A week after the move, Janet Morrison called to check on how I was settling in and to let me know that the new owners had already started making improvements to the garden. "They're absolutely in love with the property," she said. "Sarah Chen called yesterday to thank me for finding them such a perfect home. They're planning to restore your wife's rose garden and add a swing set in the backyard for their children." "That's nice," I said, and found that I meant it. The house deserved to be lived in by people who appreciated it, people who saw it as a home rather than a financial asset to be eventually liquidated. "Richard, I hope you don't mind me asking, but how are you adjusting to apartment living? I know this was a big change for you." "It's fine, Janet. Simpler than I expected." "Well, if you decide you want to buy something else, maybe a nice condo or a smaller house, I'd be happy to help you find the right property. With your budget, you'd have a lot of excellent options." My budget? Janet was probably assuming I'd eventually buy another home, settle into a new version of the life I'd been living. But the truth was, I had no idea what I wanted to do next. For the first time in 40 years, I had no obligations, no one depending on me, no legacy to maintain. It was terrifying and liberating in equal measure. 2 weeks after moving into the apartment, I was grocery shopping when I ran into Carol Brennan, one of Margaret's closest friends from the neighborhood. Carol had been bringing casseroles and offering support during Margaret's illness and after her death. But I hadn't seen her since the week of the funeral. "Richard, I heard you sold the house." I have to admit, I was shocked. That was such a beautiful home, and I know how much it meant to you and Margaret. "It was time for a change," I said, not wanting to get into the complicated truth about David's estrangement and my decision to liquidate his inheritance. "Well, I think it's healthy that you're not letting yourself get stuck in the past. Too many widowers just sit in their empty houses feeling sorry for themselves." "Where are you living now?" I told her about the apartment, and Carol nodded approvingly. "Good for you. And how are David and the grandchildren?" I imagine they were surprised by your decision to sell. "We're not in contact right now," I said carefully. Carol's expression shifted from casual interest to concern. "Oh my, I'm sorry to hear that. Family disagreements can be so painful, especially when grandchildren are involved." "Yes, they can be. Well, I'm sure it will work itself out. David's a good boy. He'll come around eventually." A good boy. If only Carol knew about the text message, the blocked phone numbers, the security cameras pointed at the street to keep me away from my own grandchildren. That evening, I found myself thinking about Carol's certainty that David would come around eventually. It was the same optimism Margaret had always shown about our son, the same faith that love and time could heal any rift. But Margaret had died before seeing how thoroughly David could cut someone out of his life when they became inconvenient. 3 weeks after selling the house, I received a certified letter addressed to my old residence, but forwarded to the apartment by the postal service. The return address showed David's name, and my heart started racing as I signed for it. Wondering if this was finally the apology I'd been hoping for, the acknowledgement that his no-contact ultimatum had been a mistake. Instead, I found a 2-page letter written by David and Rebecca together, alternating paragraphs in their distinctive handwriting. It was unlike anything I'd ever received from them. Formal, legalistic, and completely devoid of warmth or familial affection. "Dear Richard," it began, using my first name rather than Dad in a way that felt deliberately distancing. "We have recently learned that you sold the family home at 412 Maple Street without informing us of your intention to do so. As you know, this property has significant sentimental value to our family, and we had understood it would remain in the family for future generations. We are deeply concerned about this decision and the circumstances surrounding it. Your recent behavior suggests that you may not be thinking clearly about major financial decisions. Selling a family home worth nearly $500,000 just months after your wife's death appears to be an impulsive action that you may later regret. We are requesting that you provide us with documentation showing how the proceeds from this sale are being managed. As your only family members, we feel a responsibility to ensure that you are not being taken advantage of by unscrupulous financial advisors or real estate agents. We are also requesting that you meet with us to discuss your long-term care and financial planning. It's important that we all have a clear understanding of your wishes and capabilities as you enter this phase of your life. Please respond to this letter within 2 weeks. If we don't hear from you, we may need to explore other options to ensure your well-being and protect your interests." The letter was signed David and Rebecca Patterson and included their new address in Colorado, confirming that they had indeed moved out of state. I read the letter 3 times, each reading making me angrier than the last. David and Rebecca had cut me out of their lives completely, blocked my attempts at communication, and moved across the country without telling me. But now that I had sold their inheritance, suddenly, I was family again. Suddenly my well-being was their responsibility, and my financial decisions required their oversight. The implication that I might not be thinking clearly was particularly galling. I had managed my finances successfully for 40 years, built a comfortable retirement, and navigated the complex process of selling real estate without making any mistakes or falling victim to fraud. But because my decision didn't align with their expectations, clearly I must be experiencing some form of cognitive decline. And the threat buried in that final paragraph, "We may need to explore other options," sounded suspiciously like they were considering legal action to have me declared incompetent so they could control my assets. I drafted 3 different responses to their letter over the next few days. The first was angry and accusatory, pointing out the hypocrisy of their sudden concern for my welfare after months of silence. The second was defensive, explaining my reasons for selling the house and asserting my right to make my own financial decisions. The third was pleading, asking them to reconsider their harsh treatment and give our relationship another chance. In the end, I didn't send any of them. David had asked me not to contact them. He'd blocked my phone calls, my emails, and my attempts to visit. He'd moved to another state without providing a forwarding address. But now that he wanted something from me, information about my finances and control over my decisions, suddenly communication was not only acceptable but demanded. If David wanted to know how I was managing the proceeds from the house sale, he could wonder. If he wanted to discuss my long-term care, he could discuss it with Rebecca. If he wanted to ensure my well-being, he could start by treating me like a human being rather than a bank account with a pulse. Instead of responding to their letter, I made an appointment with Harold Brewster, the estate planning attorney who had helped Margaret and me draft our wills 5 years earlier. "Richard, good to see you again. I was sorry to hear about Margaret's passing. She was a lovely woman." "Thank you, Harold. I'm here because I need to make some changes to my will." "Of course. What kind of changes are we talking about?" "I want to remove David as my beneficiary and leave everything to charity instead." Harold's eyebrows rose slightly, but his expression remained professionally neutral. "That's a significant change. Richard, can you tell me what's prompted this decision?" I explained about David's text message, the complete communication cutoff, his move to Colorado, and the threatening letter I'd received after selling the house. Harold listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on his legal pad. "So your son has refused all contact with you for over 2 months. But now that he's learned you've liquidated what he considered his inheritance, he wants to assert control over your financial decisions." "That's exactly right. And he's moved out of state without providing you with any way to reach him or see your grandchildren." "Correct." Harold set down his pen and looked at me directly. "Richard, I've been practicing estate law for 30 years, and I've seen every variation of family dysfunction you can imagine. What you're describing is not uncommon. Adult children who maintain relationships with their parents, primarily for financial reasons, then become hostile when they realize those financial benefits might be at risk. So you don't think I'm being too harsh?" "I think you're being realistic. If your son has made it clear that he doesn't want you in his life except as a source of future financial support, then you have every right to reconsider whether he deserves that support. What would you recommend?" "Well, there are several options. You could leave everything to established charities, which is what many of my clients choose when they've become estranged from their families. You could set up a trust for your grandchildren that your son couldn't access, or you could wait and see if David changes his attitude once he realizes the consequences of his behavior." "What do you think David will do when he learns I've changed the will?" Harold smiled grimly. "Based on what you've told me about his recent behavior, I think he'll probably threaten legal action, claiming you're not competent to make financial decisions. It's a common strategy when adult children realize they've been cut out of an inheritance they were counting on." "Can he do that? Can he have me declared incompetent?" "He can try, but it would be very difficult to prove. You've demonstrated sound judgment in your financial decisions, you're living independently, and you're clearly articulated about your reasoning for these changes. The fact that you sold your house for fair market value and are managing the proceeds responsibly actually works in your favor." I left Harold's office with a new will that left my entire estate, now worth over $500,000, to a combination of charities that Margaret and I had supported during her lifetime. The local animal shelter where she'd volunteered, the Cancer Research Foundation that had tried to save her life, the children's hospital where Emma and Jake had been born back when I'd been welcome in their lives. David would inherit nothing. Not the house he'd been counting on. Not the savings I'd accumulated over 40 years of work. Not the life insurance policy that was supposed to provide for his family's future. Nothing except the knowledge that his actions had consequences. That love and financial support were not unconditional rights to be taken for granted. 2 days after signing the new will, I decided to take a vacation. I'd never traveled alone before. Every trip Margaret and I had taken had been planned together, discussed for months in advance, carefully budgeted and researched. But now I had more money than I'd ever had in my life, and no one to answer to about how I spent it. I booked a 2-week cruise to Alaska, something Margaret had always wanted to do but which we'd postponed repeatedly because of work obligations, family commitments, and the general inertia that keeps people from pursuing their dreams while they still can. The night before I left for the cruise, David called my apartment landline, the one number he hadn't thought to block. I let it ring 4 times before answering, curious about what could have prompted him to break his own no-contact rule. "Dad." His voice sounded uncertain, younger somehow than it had in years. "David, I wasn't expecting to hear from you. I know we said we needed space, but I've been thinking about everything that's happened, and I wanted to talk." "What did you want to talk about?" "About the house. About why you sold it without telling us. About what's going on with you and whether you're okay. Whether I was okay." After 2 months of absolute silence, after moving across the country without a forwarding address, after sending a threatening letter questioning my mental competence, now David wanted to know if I was okay. "I'm fine, David. Better than I've been in months, actually. But Dad, the house. That was our family home. That was where you and Mom built your life together, where I grew up. Why would you sell it to strangers?" "Because it's my house, and I can sell it to whoever I want to sell it to. But we thought, Mom always talked about keeping it in the family. We thought it would be ours someday." "Ours, David? You told me not to contact you again. You blocked my phone calls and moved to Colorado without telling me. How exactly did you expect to inherit a house from someone you refused to speak to?" There was a long pause. "Dad, I know we haven't handled this well. Rebecca and I have been going through a lot of stress lately, and maybe we overreacted to some things. But that doesn't mean we stopped caring about you. It doesn't. Because from where I'm sitting, cutting off all communication and moving across the country looked exactly like you'd stopped caring about me. We didn't move because of you. Dad, I got a job offer in Denver, and it was too good to pass up. The timing was just coincidental." "Coincidental?" His decision to cut me out of his life and his decision to move to another state had happened within weeks of each other, but apparently that was just a coincidence. "David, what do you want?" "I want us to work this out. I want our family to be okay again, and I want to understand what's happening with your finances, because some of the decisions you've been making seem really impulsive and unlike you, such as selling a house worth $500,000 just months after Mom died, such as moving into some apartment instead of buying another place, such as not talking to us about any of these major life changes." "Why would I talk to you about anything? You told me not to contact you, but Dad, that was about day-to-day stuff. We never meant that you couldn't call us about important things. Day-to-day stuff, like wanting to take my grandchildren to the county fair, or checking in on my son's well-being, or maintaining any kind of relationship with the only family I had left in the world." "David," I said, my voice getting colder, "you don't get to cut someone out of your life completely and then complain when they make decisions without consulting you. You don't get to move across the country and then act surprised when your father sells his house to strangers instead of preserving it for children who want nothing to do with him. That's not fair." "Dad, we never said we wanted nothing to do with you. You said not to contact you again. What exactly did you think that meant?" Another long pause. "Look, maybe we can start over. Maybe we can put all this behind us and figure out how to be a family again. Start over. Put it all behind us. Figure out how to be a family again." Now that David had learned his inheritance was gone and realized he might need to rebuild his relationship with his father if he wanted to benefit from his death. "I'm going on a cruise tomorrow, David. I'll be gone for 2 weeks. "A cruise, Dad? You hate cruises. You and Mom always said they were floating prisons for people with no imagination. Maybe. I've changed my mind about a lot of things. Dad, please, can we talk about this when you get back? Can we sit down and figure out how to fix our relationship?" "I'll think about it," I said, and hung up before he could respond. The next morning, I boarded a ship bound for Alaska with 700 other passengers and a sense of freedom I hadn't felt since before Margaret's diagnosis. For 2 weeks, I would be completely unreachable, completely free from the complicated dynamics of family relationships and financial obligations. For 2 weeks, I could be just Richard Patterson, a man with no past and no future except what he chose for himself. It was the best vacation of my life. I returned from Alaska with a suntan, 200 photos of glaciers and wildlife, and a clarity about my life that I hadn't possessed in years. The cruise had been everything Margaret and I had imagined it would be: spectacular scenery, comfortable accommodations, and the kind of peaceful solitude that allows you to think clearly about what really matters. What mattered, I'd realized somewhere between Juneau and Ketchikan, was not the relationships you'd lost, but the life you still had to live. There were 17 voicemail messages waiting when I got back to my apartment. 14 of them from David and 3 from Rebecca. I listened to the first few, which started with apologies and requests to call back, then progressed through increasing desperation to barely concealed threats about taking action to protect your interests if you won't protect them yourself. I deleted them all without calling back. The next morning, I was unpacking my suitcase when there was a knock at my apartment door. Through the peephole, I could see David standing in the hallway, looking older and more haggard than he had the last time I'd seen him. He was alone, which surprised me. Rebecca was usually his backup in any family confrontation. I opened the door but didn't invite him in. David, I wasn't expecting you. Dad, we need to talk. Can I come in? I thought you moved to Colorado. I flew back just to see you. We need to straighten this out. I studied my son's face, looking for some sign of the boy who used to help me work on cars in the garage, who used to ask me to read just one more chapter before bedtime, who used to call me his hero. But all I could see was a desperate man who'd finally realized that actions have consequences. All right, I said, stepping aside. Come in. David walked into my small living room and looked around with barely concealed disdain. The furnished apartment was a far cry from the house where he'd grown up, and his expression made it clear that he considered my new living situation to be evidence of some kind of mental decline. Dad, what is this place? Why are you living like this when you have $500,000 from selling the house? I'm living like this because I want to. It's quiet, it's simple, and I don't have to maintain a 4-bedroom house for someone who doesn't want to visit anyway. David sat down on the couch and put his head in his hands. Dad, I know I handled things badly. I know the text message was harsh, and I know we should have handled our problems differently. But that doesn't mean you should have sold our family home to strangers. It was my family home, David, mine, and your mother's. You made it clear that you didn't want to be part of this family anymore. That's not what I meant, and you know it. I was angry about some things, and I said things I shouldn't have said. But I never meant that I didn't want you in my life permanently. Then what did you mean? Because from where I was sitting, don't contact us again seemed pretty permanent. David looked up at me with tears in his eyes. I meant I needed some time to cool off. I meant I was tired of feeling like nothing I did was ever good enough for you, like you were always judging my choices and finding them lacking. So you solved that problem by cutting me out of your life entirely. I solved that problem badly. But Dad, that doesn't justify what you've done. Selling the house, moving into this place, changing your whole life without talking to any of us about it. It's not like you. Maybe you don't know me as well as you think you do. David was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was smaller, more vulnerable than I'd heard it sound since he was a child. Dad, are you trying to punish me? Is this all about making me pay for that text message? The question caught me off guard. Was I trying to punish David? Was selling the house and changing my will about revenge rather than self-preservation? David, I said carefully, when you told me not to contact you, when you blocked my phone calls and moved across the country, what did you think would happen? Did you think I'd just sit in that empty house waiting for you to decide you needed me again? I thought you'd give us some space and then we'd figure out how to fix things. While you were living in Colorado, while you were refusing to take my calls or answer my emails, how exactly were we supposed to fix anything? I don't know. I just thought. I thought you'd always be there. I thought the house would always be there. I thought I could come back when I was ready and everything would be the same. There it was. The truth I'd suspected but hadn't wanted to acknowledge. David had assumed that my love, my home, and my financial support would remain constant regardless of how he treated me. He'd thought he could put our relationship on hold indefinitely while pursuing his own goals, then return when it was convenient and find everything exactly as he'd left it. David, I'm not a museum. I'm not going to preserve your childhood home and your inheritance indefinitely while you decide whether you want me in your life. But Dad, that house was all we had left of Mom, her garden, her kitchen, all the memories of our family. You sold all of that to strangers. I sold a house, David. The memories are still here, I said, tapping my chest. But those memories don't obligate me to maintain a shrine to the past for someone who doesn't want to be part of my future. David was crying now, and I felt a familiar tug of parental concern that I'd been fighting for months. This was still my son, still the child I'd raised and loved and worried about for 32 years. But he was also the adult who had chosen his career and his comfort over his relationship with his father, and who was now facing the consequences of that choice. Dad, what can I do to fix this? How can I make things right between us? I don't know if you can, David. Trust, once broken, is very hard to repair, but we're family. That has to count for something. Family is about more than DNA. Son, it's about showing up, about being present, about treating each other with respect and consideration. You showed me that my presence in your life was unwelcome. Now you're upset because I took you at your word. David wiped his eyes and looked around the apartment again. Where's all your furniture? Where are all the family photos and Mom's things? I donated most of it. The new owners of the house bought some of it. I kept what mattered to me and let go of the rest. You donated Mom's things. His voice cracked with disbelief. I kept her jewelry and her photo albums and a few special pieces. But David, I couldn't carry a house full of furniture and memories into this new chapter of my life. Sometimes letting go is the only way to move forward. But what about Emma and Jake? What about their inheritance? What about the things that should have stayed in the family? Emma and Jake have a father who told their grandfather not to contact them. They have parents who moved them across the country to get away from their family. If you want them to have a connection to their grandmother's memory, you'll have to create that yourself. David stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the parking lot of my apartment complex. Dad, I came here to apologize. I came here to ask for another chance. But you've already made up your mind about me, haven't you? Have I? You've written me off as a bad son who doesn't deserve your love or your support. You've decided that one mistake, one moment of anger, erases 32 years of being your child. I considered his words carefully. Had I written David off? Had I decided that our relationship was irreparable? Or had I simply stopped allowing his choices to control my happiness? David, I haven't written you off. But I've stopped waiting for you to decide whether I'm worth having in your life. I've stopped preserving things for you while you figure out if you want them. I've started living for myself instead of for the possibility that someday you might remember that I'm your father. So where does that leave us? I don't know. That's up to you now. David turned back from the window. What if I want to rebuild our relationship and be the son you deserve? Then you try. But David, you don't get to start that process by demanding that I undo the life changes I've made in your absence. You don't get to insist that I buy back the house or move back to the old neighborhood or pretend that the last few months didn't happen. But the money from the house sale, what are you doing with it? Are you at least being smart about your finances? The question revealed what this conversation was really about. David hadn't flown from Colorado to apologize or to repair our relationship. He'd come to assess the damage to his future inheritance and to figure out if there was any way to salvage his financial expectations. My finances are none of your concern, David. You made that clear when you told me not to contact you. Dad, I'm your only family. Of course your finances are my concern. No, they're not. My finances are my concern. My future is my concern. My happiness is my concern. You gave up the right to be concerned about any of those things when you cut me out of your life. So that's it. You're just going to hold this grudge forever. I'm not holding a grudge, David. I'm living my life. There's a difference. David sat back down, and for a few minutes we sat in silence. I could see him processing what I'd said, trying to figure out if there was any angle he hadn't considered, any argument that might change my mind about the house, or the inheritance, or the future he'd been counting on. Dad, he said finally, what if something happens to you? What if you get sick or have an accident? Who's going to take care of you? I'll figure that out when the time comes. People manage to age and die without children all the time. David, I'm sure I can learn how to do it too, but you don't have to. You have me. You have Rebecca and the kids. We're your family, and we love you. You love me now. You didn't love me enough to return my phone calls 3 months ago, but you love me now that you've learned I sold the house you were planning to inherit. That's not fair, isn't it? David, when did you last call me just to see how I was doing? When did you last visit without needing something? When did you last act like someone who loved me rather than someone who was managing an elderly relative until they became useful again? David couldn't answer that question, because we both knew what the answer was. His love had been conditional on my usefulness. And when I'd stopped being useful, when I'd become a source of criticism rather than support, he'd discarded me like an appliance that had outlived its purpose. I want to be different, he said quietly. I want to be the son you deserve, but I don't know how to do that if you've already given up on me. I haven't given up on you, David, but I'm not going to spend the rest of my life trying to earn your attention or hoping you'll remember that I exist. If you want a relationship with me, you'll have to build it. If you want my respect, you'll have to earn it. And if you want any part of my legacy, you'll have to prove that you value the person creating it, not just the assets he might leave behind. David left my apartment that day without any promises about changed behavior or renewed commitment to our relationship. He left with the understanding that I was no longer the same father who would accept any treatment from him as long as he occasionally acknowledged my existence. A week later, I received a handwritten letter from Emma, my 7-year-old granddaughter. Someone had clearly helped her with the spelling and grammar, but the sentiment was unmistakably hers. Dear Grandpa, Daddy told me you moved to a new house and that you might be sad. I made you a drawing of our family with you in it because I don't want you to forget that I love you. Daddy says maybe we can visit you soon if you want us to. I miss you, and I hope you are happy in your new house. Love, Emma. Enclosed with the letter was a crayon drawing of stick figures holding hands under a rainbow, with Grandpa written in careful 7-year-old letters under one of the figures. I sat at my kitchen table reading Emma's letter and looking at her drawing, feeling something shift inside me that I hadn't expected. This wasn't David trying to manipulate me into changing my mind about the inheritance. This was my granddaughter, who had no idea about wills or real estate or the complicated dynamics between adults, reaching out because she missed her grandfather. That evening, I called David's number in Colorado. He answered on the second ring. Dad, David, I got Emma's letter. She insisted on sending it. I hope that's okay. It's more than okay. David, I want you to understand something. My feelings about you and my feelings about my grandchildren are separate things. Whatever problems you and I have, Emma and Jake shouldn't suffer for them. Does that mean you'd be willing to see them? It means I'm willing to consider it. But David, if you use my love for those children to manipulate me into changing my financial decisions, if you treat their relationship with me as leverage to get what you want, then you'll lose that possibility permanently. I understand. Do you? Because I need to be very clear about something. The house is gone. The inheritance you were expecting is gone. Those things are not negotiable, and they're not coming back regardless of how our relationship develops from here. There was a long pause. Are you saying there's nothing left? That you've spent all the money from the house? I'm saying that what I do with my money is not contingent on your approval or your needs. I'm saying that if you want a relationship with me, it has to be because you value me as a person, not because you're hoping to inherit something from me. Dad, that's not— I mean, of course I value you as a person. Then prove it. Show me that you can have a relationship with your father without expecting anything from him, except his company and his love. 6 months later, David did visit with the children. It was awkward at first, too much history and hurt feelings for easy conversation, but Emma and Jake bridged the gap with their natural childhood enthusiasm. They loved my apartment, declared my new neighborhood cool, and spent the weekend asking questions about Alaska and looking at my cruise photos. David was more subdued, more careful with his words than he'd ever been as an adult. He asked about my life, my health, my plans for the future, without once mentioning money or inheritance or the house he'd lost. It was a start. Over the following months, we developed a cautious new relationship built on different foundations than the old one. David called occasionally, not because he needed something, but because he'd seen something that reminded him of me. He sent photos of the children, updates about his new job in Denver, stories about their life in Colorado that included me in a way his communications hadn't for years. I never changed my will. The money from the house sale remained earmarked for charity, as did the remainder of my estate. David never asked about it again, and I never volunteered the information. It was a boundary that we both learned to respect. His relationship with me was separate from any expectations about my death. A year after selling the house, I used some of the proceeds to take Emma and Jake on a trip to Disneyland, their first airplane ride, their first big adventure with their grandfather. David came along, and for 5 days we were just a family enjoying each other's company without the complicated undercurrents of obligation and resentment that had poisoned our relationship for so long. On the last night of the trip, as we were sitting by the hotel pool watching the children swim, David brought up the subject I'd been wondering if he'd ever addressed directly. Dad, I owe you an apology that I've never properly given you. For what specifically? For treating you like a bank instead of a father? For assuming that your love and your financial support were things I was entitled to regardless of how I treated you? For thinking I could put our relationship on hold indefinitely while still expecting to benefit from it? I appreciate that, David. I also want you to know that I understand why you sold the house and why you changed your will. I don't like it, and I won't pretend it doesn't hurt, but I understand it. How did you know I changed my will? Because I would have done the same thing in your position. Because when someone treats you the way I treated you, you don't reward that behavior with a $500,000 inheritance. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching Emma and Jake play Marco Polo with a group of other children they'd met at the hotel. Do you regret it? David asked eventually. Selling the house, I mean. Do you miss it? I thought about the question for a moment. Did I miss the house where I'd raised my son and loved my wife? Did I regret trading that history for a small apartment and the freedom to live without expectations? I miss your mother, I said finally. I miss the life we had together, and the plans we made that didn't include her dying at 67, but the house. No, I don't miss the house. The house was just a building. The family that made it a home was already gone before I sold it. And now, I looked at my son, this man who had learned the hard way that love requires investment, that relationships need maintenance, that taking people for granted eventually costs you their presence in your life. Now we're building something new, I said. Something based on choice rather than obligation. Something that doesn't depend on inheritance or property or any of the things that can be bought and sold and transferred from one person to another. David nodded, understanding passing between us that felt more genuine than anything we'd shared since his mother's death. I love you, Dad, he said. Not because of what you might leave me, but because you're my father and you've always been there for me, even when I didn't deserve it. I love you too, son. And I'm glad we figured out how to be a family again, even if it's a different kind of family than we used to be. That night, as I watched my grandchildren sleep in the hotel beds and listened to David talking quietly on the phone with Rebecca about their flight home, I realized that selling the house had given me something more valuable than the money in my bank account. It had given me the knowledge that the people in my life chose to be there, not because they had to be, not because they expected something from me, but because they wanted to be.